Okay, we're back now, and we're going to talk about WINS. Now, Windows Internet naming service system or server, any of those would be valid depending upon what we're talking about. And WINS will resolve, here I have maps, but I like the word resolves better, changes a NetBIOS name to an IP address. Now, a NetBIOS name is the computer name. It would be NetBIOS names are 15 characters, and I had not intended to do this, but we're going to talk about WINS there. Let's do, I don't know that we've done this before. NetBIOS 16th character. There we go. So if I look up NetBIOS 16th character, if I go down here, I should have, normally I have, should have looked this up ahead of time, sorry. So the NetBIOS name can be 15 characters, and then the 16th character is actually a hex pair, because the ASCII, and if I we keep going. So if I look up the ASCII table, which the extended ASCII table goes from 0 to 255. There's one. All right. So the extended ASCII table goes from 0 to 255, and there's an individual character for each one. So the NetBIOS name that I can give a machine is 15 characters. The 16th character actually, so if the 16th character here was an N, that is actually 4E, and 4E would have potentially a code on the here. So 4E doesn't, but there's BE, which is a network monitor agent. So these are functions. Here we have computer name, and some of those will be group names or domain names. This tells me, so the first 15 characters is my name, Scott, and the 16th character, the last character in there, and let's say it's 01. This just is a broadcast that says, and oh, well, that was bad. Let's get something that's not, let's get something that's a real character here. Let's see, do we have something in the, okay, 31, nope, that's a unit separator, 40 something, 45's at SMS client remote chat, which you'd never see, but so I've got a character there, I got a symbol there that actually would be interpreted as something here. So this is an old list. We don't use this list very much now, but the first 15 characters I would give as an administrator, and then the 16th character is actually assigned, and there could be multiple. So if I actually did 4 or 5 or 6 things, so let's say I have a folder shared. If I have a folder shared, I have the file server service running on my machine, even though this is a client, and I would have 20 at the end of my name. If I'm also running the messenger service and I'm a master browser, I would have my name and then an 03 and my name and an 01. So my name would actually appear 3 different times. And what happens is the browse list gets populated. If I open up Explorer and went to the network portion, it actually looks out and tries to build a browse list or get the browse list to see who's out there. And it sees the machines that are out there, and the machines can actually see this 16th character, and this 16th character tells my machine what the other machines can do for me. The server from client, we used a client with someone using a resource from somebody else, and a server with someone sharing a resource with the group. These are server services. They could be that other machines could use. They could actually be, Windows 95 machines could be a file server service. Could be available to, and that's how you see you're only going to show up in that list, the network list, if you have something shared, you have one of these services available to the group. Anyway, long story made even longer there. But the 16th character is going to come up when we look at IP tools, because NBTstat, NetBIOS over TCP/IP, actually will have that. So we kind of looked at it a little early. All right, so it maps that NetBIOS name to an IP address. What it does is it builds a table. Well, hang on. Let me start by saying this is a legacy computer name registration that maps their NetBIOS names to IP addresses. WINS is still available, still gets used quite a bit. It's still useful, but Microsoft stopped using it, or built its functionality into DNS, domain name service or system, and said here, if you don't already have WINS, don't instead deploy DNS. DNS provides computer name registration and resolution services. So it's called dynamic DNS. And what we used to do, we got to talk about an FQDN, a fully qualified domain name. This is kind of a little DNS too. So we're getting into a lot of different things here. Our cat is meowing at the door of my office, so if you hear something. So let's say www.scottco.com, my imaginary URL that I don't own. So www is the host. Scottco would be the domain name. .com would be the domain suffix. Oh, and there is actually a really good DNS video. I think it's on Canvas below that. It just says videos. But the first one is DNS, and it's really good. It talks about the dot at the end. So there's actually 4. This is actually the root. So fully qualified domain name actually has 4 pieces. When we first started, I was at Eastern back 91, 92 as a grad assistant in the computer and operations management department. And it was my job at one point to surf the internet before we had browsers. Mosaic was still being developed at the U of I, so we didn't have any graphical browsers. You had to do everything from one hop to the next. I browsed from Eastern to UCLA's library, and I think it took maybe a half hour to get there. It was all bulletin board systems, and you had to go one hop at a time, and put in an IP address of a hop. I think I went to University of Missouri St. Louis, and then I had to go to the University of Colorado, Denver, or something like that, and then somewhere else, and I finally got to UCLA. So I'm actually putting in the routers that I need to talk to from one hop to the next. So I'm manually migrating, doing what RIP and OSPF do automatically, actually BGP now, but from what we talked about, RIP and OSPF. It took forever to actually get there, and then text comes up on screen, and it was a phenomenal thing. But at that point, we had to include the root. You actually had to put the dot in so that it knew that was the root. Today, for a long time, for the last 15, 20 years, we haven't had to type in the end dot. And actually today, usually, if you don't put the www in, just do scottco.com into a browser, it'll automatically append both ends, and it'll put the www, and you don't even see the dot. And it'll take it to Scottco. If I do a ping, there is a difference. If I ping Scottco, I'm actually usually pinging their DNS server versus pinging www, which would be their web server. So this host name could also be locally my NetBIOS name. And actually net should be lowercase, but so it'd be my NetBIOS name dot whatever, my labo1.scottco.com would be my fully qualified domain name. So what used to happen was WINS Windows Internet Name Service would take care of this, and DNS would take care of the rest. Whoop. Sorry. Wins would take care of the host name, and DNS would take care of the rest of the domain name. So it was a two-parter. So if you wanted to find out the IP address of www.scottco.com, first you'd have to go to the DNS server and get the DNS server IP address of scottco.com, and then that server would then go over to its own Win server and pull the IP address of www host, give it back to DNS, and then it would move on. So Microsoft just decided it's kind of the same thing anyway, so why don't we just take DNS and make it so that it can do this dynamic resolution automatically? So dynamic DNS actually equals wins plus DNS. What used to be wins plus DNS. So today it's not as necessary, but we still it's probably about the easiest lab will do. In server class, when we want to have wins, we open up, we add a service, we click wins, we say okay, done. There's no configuration for it at all, and you'll see why when we go through this. So anyway, it is an older service, but it still gets used. You still should know about it. You're still going to be tested on it, and the same exact functionality and mechanism is available. It's just typically taken care of by the DNS server, because typically the DNS server and the Win server were the same. There was two services running in the same box anyway, so you rarely, because of what Wins did, you rarely ever split them up. Okay, so let's talk about what Wins actually does. I'm going to go back to the document camera. So Wins actually takes it maps or resolves a NetBIOS name. So basically what it has is a table. And I tell the analogy, every time it seemed like, probably not, but it seemed like every time I would go to my doctor for a checkup or blood draw or whatever I had to do, it was at Sarah Bush, and every time for a long time I would go there, because early on I would wait forever to go to the doctor. So 2 years later, I would go, and they would be in a different place, so they kept moving around, and so I just stopped going. I go and it's I don't know, it's some different type of doctor, and then I got to go back to the board and I got to look. So I got in the habit of just walking in the door and going to the directory, the doctor's directory, and looking up my doctor and figuring out what room they were in. That's essentially the same thing as what Wins does. So what Wins does in the Wins table is it has NetBIOS name, an IP address. It's just a table. When I get a DORA DHCP address, and let's say I'm Lab 01 and I just got .100. One of the other things that I would hand out typically is the Win server. So I've gotten my IP address, I've gotten my gateway, I've gotten my subnet mask, I've been given a bunch of other things, and the Win server is one of those things. So I would get the Win server address, and then one of the first things I'm going to do after I get that address is I'm going to talk to the Win server and say, hey, Win server, my name is Lab 01, and I am currently using blah, 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 whatever. Mine would be 10.6.100, or at home it would be 192.168.1.100. My host address is 100, and that's what I'm going to use. And so it's pretty simple. That is called name registration. And so we have a name registration that says, hey, I'm Lab 01 and I'm going to use .100, and the server comes back, okay. And then throughout the day, there actually is a timeout. This isn't important. I've never been tested on it, and it depends on the configuration. But there'll be a name refresh, or the server will reach out a name refresh. The server will reach out and say, "Hey, are you still there?" Basically, kind of like a ping. And then at the end of the day, if the machine is shut down properly at the end of the day, then the machine will say, "Hey, this is Lab01 and I'm getting ready to log off." And so it will erase that. If this was a board, not a piece of paper, I would just erase that. It will erase that out. So in theory, at the beginning of the day, if all the machines are shut off properly, I will have nothing in this list. As the machines start to come on, in whatever order they come on, they will populate this list. So we'll get longer and longer and longer. Let's say I have 20 machines in the lab and all 20 of them come on. This will have all 20 of those NetBIOS names and all 20 of those IP addresses. And then if I type in ping lab01, which we haven't talked about ping yet because that's coming up, but the ping command can only use IP addresses. So if I say ping space lab01, the machine can't do that. But it says, "Hey, I do know where the Win server is," and it says, "Hey, Win server, do you have the IP address for Lab01 by any chance?" And it says, "Oh yeah, it's 192.168.1.100." Okay, so I get that back. So that is the resolution that happens when I need to talk to Lab01 using an IP address. Wins gives me, or dynamic DNS, but Wins gives me that ability to do that. Now, there is if we go back here, well, let me jump back up. Dynamic constant changing list, as we said at the beginning of the day, in theory it starts at empty and it gets populated, and at the end of the day, as machines shut off, it gets shorter and shorter and shorter. So throughout the day it should get longer, then shorter. It's automatic. I don't have to worry about it. Clients register after getting an IP address and then they remove themselves. We just did that. There is this actually LM hosts. This file, LM hosts, is a static file that actually I can put on my machine, which will do the same thing. So what will happen is if I typed in ping lab01. So if I went to the command prompt and I did ping lab01, first thing it would do is it would say, well, I can't ping a NetBIOS name. So I have to resolve that, turn that into an IP address. Do I already know it? Do I have that in my cache already in RAM? If the answer is no, then it will look to the LM host file to see if it's in there. And if it's not in there, then it will talk to the Win server and it will resolve it that way. If there's no Win server, then it could put out a pure broadcast that says, "Hey, is there anybody out there using the name Lab01?" And then if there's a response back, then it would know. And that's actually the NetBIOS node type, which we don't need to know right now. But I can show you real quick. I think if I do, this gigantic mic is right in my way. IP config, config all, and I go to Ethernet, and I should have my node type, which is so this is my host name or my NetBIOS name. In this case is Lab09 because that was the machine out of the lab that I snagged. I'm doing this at home, but I snagged a machine. So I snagged 9. So that's my NetBIOS name. My node type is hybrid, and hybrid says look for a Win server first, and then if you don't find it, then broadcast. So I can just use a Win server by itself. I can just broadcast. I can broadcast first, and then if nobody responds, I can talk to the Win server. But hybrid's the best option, and that's look for a Win server, and if you don't find one, then you can go ahead and broadcast. And I don't have a Wins proxy, which is beyond the scope of what we're talking about now. And I'm not IP routing, which again is beyond the scope. I think we've covered everything else there. Okay. So, whoops. I don't want to do that. I want to do that. So we will, when we talk about DNS, we'll talk about the host file. So the host and LM host file actually, and I'll actually physically show you the host file when we talk about DNS. So WINS is pretty simple. It's pretty straightforward. On the server, you fire it up. I had a discussion one time with someone who was working at one of the schools, one of the technology coordinators, and they were actually populating the LM host file with all of the IP addresses, and then when there was a change, they added a new machine. They had to go around to each machine and actually change the LM host file. And I said, "Oh my gosh, well, why are you doing that? Why don't you set up a WINS server?" And they're like, "Well, we don't want to go through all that." I'm like, "Do you have a server, a server class machine, a Windows server on your network?" "Yeah, we use DNS." I'm like, it's going to take you 30 seconds to load a WINS server. You go in and add a service and you check a box and you say okay, and it's done, and it takes care of it. So we don't use the LM host file very often, really rarely, because WINS does such a good job, and now dynamic DNS has taken over and does that. But it's pretty simple, and you will need to know what WINS stands for. You'll need to know that LM hosts actually maps to the WINS service, and the basics of the registration process and removal process. So pretty good. Next one's going to be DNS, and we'll keep going and run through that, and then we'll jump into IP tools, and that'll be pretty quick. So we got 2 more lectures on this page before we're all done, and then we'll get down to a quiz over all that. So that'll be fun. All right, talk to you next time.